Hello, my name is Cameron Rose, and I am a student at the University of Nevada, Reno, where, for my final for English class of Topics in Cultural Rhetorics and Identity with Professor Chris Earle, I am going to be discussing an educational video on a recent Supreme Court decision in Martin v. Boise and comparing it with the rhetoric that is associated with homelessness. Before I begin, I feel it is important to give some personal background information. As prior to becoming a student in the fall 2020 semester, I was homeless. And since the Martin case will pertain to homelessness, this was a decision that has personal relevance to me. And while homeless, I had spent over 10 years educating myself in the law and consider myself to be an autodidact in the law, meaning I am self-educated in the law, although I recognize that my education is not complete. The reason that I started educating myself in the law was specifically because I was tired of being harassed by law enforcement and being criminalized over being homeless and my disabilities, which Martin will pertain to, where I am currently working on being able to formalize my legal education by starting with my undergraduate degree in philosophy. Through this video, I hope to educate people on the Martin versus Boise decision so that we can understand the impacts that it's having, and I hope to further discuss the rhetoric that is going around so that we can understand how damaging it is to homeless. First, before we can understand Martin v. Boise, we first must discuss Bell et al. Versus Boise, which was a 2009 lawsuit in the Ninth Circuit of Appeals by 6 homeless plaintiffs represented by the law office of Howard Beldoff against the city of Boise, Idaho, regarding the city's anti-camping ordinances. The plaintiffs argued that criminalizing public sleeping in a city without adequate shelter space constitute criminalizing homelessness itself, in violation of the Eighth Amendment, citing Jones v. City of Los Angeles, Ninth Circuit's 2006. The Jones case held that enforcement of anti-camping ordinances may violate the Eighth Amendment on nights where there is inadequate shelter space for all of a city's homeless individuals. The defendants, the city of Boise, on the other hand, asserted that plaintiffs' reliance on Jones was heavily misplaced, factually unsupported, and immaterial to the case. As a result of the conflicting opinions, on August 6, 2015, the Department of Justice filed a 15-page statement of interest due to the clear significant dispute between the parties on the applicability of Jones to make clear that the Jones framework is the appropriate legal framework for analyzing plaintiffs' Eighth Amendment claims. Under the decision, 3 key factors were made clear by the Department of Justice. If a court finds that it is impossible for homeless individuals to secure shelter space on some nights because no beds are available, no shelter meets their disability needs, or they've exceeded the maximum stay limitations, then a court should also find that enforcement of the ordinance under those circumstances criminalizes the status of being homeless and violates the Eighth Amendment to the Constitution. First, the Department of Justice noted Ingram v. Wright, 1977, which holds that the cruel and unusual punishment clause of the Eighth Amendment imposes substantive limits on what can be made criminal and punished as such. Next, they used Robinson v. California, in which Robinson, the court considered a state statute criminalizing not only the possession or use of narcotics, but also addiction, noting that the status made an addicted person continuously guilty of this offense, whether or not he had ever used or possessed any narcotics within the state. And further, that addiction is a status, which may be contracted innocently or involuntarily, given that a person may even be a narcotics addict from the moment of his birth. The court found that the statute impermissibly criminalized the status of addiction and constituted cruel and unusual punishment. And 6 years after the Robinson decision, the Powell Court considered the constitutionality of a statute that criminalized public intoxication. The plurality found that there was insufficient evidence to definitively say Mr. Powell was incapable of avoiding public intoxication. The dissenting justices, on the other hand, found that the Eighth Amendment protects against criminalization of conduct that individuals are powerless to avoid, and that due to his alcoholism, Mr. Powell was powerless to avoid public drunkenness. To bring clarity on what these means, under Robinson, the Eighth Amendment limits only the criminalization of status, not of conduct. For example, being homeless or disabled would be examples of status, while stealing a person's property would be an example of conduct. A person is criminalized for stealing even if they are homeless, as it is not a criminalization of the status, but of the misconduct of stealing. Additionally, whether a person would be continuously guilty of an offense without intention will be highlighted, as this is the point of Powell, where the question is whether the conduct is inextricably linked to one's status, such that punishing the conduct is indistinguishable from punishing the status. Meaning, does a person have a choice? We can see this in the stealing property example, and will be similar to what the Jones case would take into consideration, as when homeless individuals had no other choice but to sleep in public, that this therefore criminalized the status of homelessness itself. And under Jones, 2 points were made. One, that the enforcement of anti-camping ordinances violates the 8th Amendment on nights where there is inadequate shelter space for all of a city's homeless individuals. And as the Jones court noted, it is impossible for individuals to avoid sitting, lying, and sleeping for days, weeks, or months at a time, as if human beings could remain in perpetual motion. Once an individual becomes homeless, by virtue of this status, certain life necessities, such as sleeping, that would otherwise be performed in private, must now be performed in public. Therefore, sleeping in public is precisely the type of universal and unavoidable conduct that is necessary for human survival for homeless individuals who lack access to shelter space. Next, I will be discussing the rhetoric that is associated with homelessness and how it is inaccurate and harmful to homeless.
The main problem keeping homelessness from being solved is that the issue has been totally misdiagnosed. They're on the street, so apparently there's not enough food, jobs, or housing for them. Wrong diagnosis. The correct diagnosis is there's abundant food, housing, and jobs, and they are unwilling to make the changes in their lifestyle that are keeping them without those things.
It's kind of a common misconception I think that people have about homeless is that, oh, they're all just drug addicts or they're all just alcoholics, or and what we find is that the addiction kind of becomes a coping mechanism for them to, in order to cope with living on the streets or staying in the cold. A lot of times what I hear is people say, yeah, I drink to stay warm.
The coping mechanisms of homeless in order to help facilitate the issues of the problem cannot be understated. As was mentioned, alcohol is often used just to stay warm. But let's look at the impact of what criminalizing homeless has done to homeless. We currently recognizably have a meth epidemic, and that problem is associated and classified and directed towards the homeless. Why? This is specifically because they have been criminalized for sleeping. They have no place to go. They have no place to sleep. And because of this, this drug provides them the opportunity to stay up and keep going despite the negative connotations that also come with this drug. And as was also noted, most people that become homeless didn't start becoming homeless because they were addicted to drugs. In fact, most, through the hardship of going through being homeless, then become addicted to drugs. As after becoming homeless, it becomes about a person's resilience on whether they want to do the drugs or not, because it inevitably comes about choice. But it cannot be understated that these choices are often influenced by the circumstances in which they are living. But for those that do become addicted to drugs, what tends to end up happening is they become stuck. And this is a very common theme in which you will hear from many homeless, in which they will become stuck until anything changes. And luckily for me, that was my circumstances, in which allowed me to get back into school and why I am no longer homeless.
The problem is you get trapped here, and people say, I panhandle for money. People say, get a job. Okay, well, if I had somewhere to rest my head where my stuff wasn't stolen, where I didn't have to worry about blankets, where I didn't have to worry about food, I might be able to get a job. But then also, I've been seen through this entire town now, and now I'm known as homeless. So to get a job, I have to leave the area. I have nowhere to shower daily. I have nowhere to keep work clothes. It's not as easy as get a job, you know?
And you don't get much sleep.
No, right.
Because you're in survival mode, and the other night I met somebody and his shoes were stolen while I was sleeping.
Yeah, right. Yeah, well, that's a very funny thing. Your shoes get stolen a lot while you're here. And who steals a homeless man's shoes? Your shoes can be completely worthless, and someone still takes them. And that's a really hard thing, because you wake up in the morning and you've got no shoes. Now you got to walk around where people throw broken glass, people piss on the ground, cockroaches, and you got to look for shoes. And that's very disheartening. That's one of the strangest things I've come across here. I've had shoes that are completely worthless and stink so bad somewhere, and someone still takes them.
As is discussed by Luke, it's not as easy as just get a job, as many people would like to think, as it's really hard to even get a job when you can't shower. You have no place to store your stuff because you can't take your stuff to work, and you can't leave your stuff lying around, because if you leave your stuff lying around, it's going to end up missing. And then if you don't have your sleeping stuff, how do you get an adequate night's sleep so that you can go to work in order to keep this whole cycle going? So we can see this whole personal belief that there is adequate jobs, there is adequate housing, there is all of this stuff. There may be stuff available, but it's not being presented available for those who are homeless, because they are still not capable of obtaining these things without jumping through immense hoops.
Most of the newly reformed homeless wouldn't be able to afford shelter, even if they were working. Let's look at data from the 2016 census. About 30,000 households in Reno have income of less than $2,500 per month. They can only pay $750 or less for rent and still have enough for other expenses. Now, let's look at places listed by Apartments.com in December. Only 5% were $750 or less. There simply isn't enough affordable housing in Reno. This isn't just theory. Person after homeless person complains of being unable to afford shelter.
I have people that throw me $10, $20 and think that's going to solve everything, and next time they're mad at me because I'm off the street because they're $10 or $20. But I'm at a point where I'm stuck. This is what I do. I've become comfortable with it. I don't see no other way out. Like I said, I feel like I'm falling and never hitting a bottom, or at least hitting a bottom that's false. And every time I go to try to climb out, that bottom's pulled for me, and I fall more. If I could reach an absolute solid bottom, I might be able to climb out. But there is no real bottom, because it's always being pulled out from under you.
I have a friend that's homeless. He's a veteran, and on Veterans Day, he was beaten up. I'll never understand that kind of stuff, other than people telling people that homeless is no, you're no good if you're homeless. You're just a lazy bum, and that's not the truth. In the last 2 years, I have seen more elderly and women and single parents with children coming to the streets.
The ones that fight for disability too.
And the ones fighting for disability.
Banks. Another factor aggravating the homeless situation is the city council's refusal to direct the Reno Police Department to enforce the municipal code. Being under the influence publicly, aggressive panhandling, sleeping in illegal places, using the bathroom in public.
First, even the Powell court recognized but did not make a decision because the circumstances were not that Powell had no other choice but to drink in public due to being homeless, but did leave this idea open and receptive due to the idea of being involuntary, due to the idea of the involuntariness that was presented in the Powell decision, where again, the importance of the involuntariness of an act is going to be important when we discuss people peeing or urinating or defecating in public, as these people often have no other choice. Why? Because they're not permitted to use the casinos. They cannot take their property. They cannot leave their property. They cannot do a lot of stuff that other people would often do, especially at night when majority of bathrooms are closed.
Sorry, I'm getting to the camping part. I'm very
No worries.
distracted because
Camping, like I said, you can read that later. So when we got here, okay, the park was closed. So I'm going to give everybody one last opportunity. If we can move to the sidewalk.
Is that what he told you to do? Because you were getting somewhere before this.
Yeah, you were reading this, and you never did mention if you can cover all of this.
No, that's when I talked. Remember I said we have a difference of opinion of what the Ninth Circuit said. That's where it
not
comes down to.
This is the Supreme Court said this.
Okay.
The Supreme Court took this in 2009.
This isn't a difference of opinion. It's a refusal to obey the law from those clothed as actors of the law. Kristen Hackbarth for This Is Reno on October 26, 2022, wrote a story on how Washoe County, which is in Reno, has the highest rate of homelessness in Nevada. Where in the article, it is also noted that Nevada is ranked 10th in the nation overall for the rate of homelessness. But in order for this ordinance to even be legal, there would need to be available beds for all of the Washoe County homeless population in order for the county to be in compliance.
The shelters are almost always filled to capacity.
According to Our Town Reno on February 14th, 2022, they reported that the county shelter dashboard indicates that there are 603 available beds, often nearly all filled. On December 7th, as reported by This Is Reno, that the CARES campus only had 12 beds available. And on December 13th, as reported by KOL News Channel 8 and Fox News, that the CARE campus only had 23 beds available. And according to News Channel 2 on May 17th, it was reported that the data collected as of February 24th, 2022, 1,605 people were homeless in the Washoe County area, with 417 identified as unsheltered. The fact remains, though, that the city of Reno and Washoe County cannot provide shelter for all of its homeless, and the disputing fact is simply that, well, they have some beds, so that means that they can still enforce the ordinances despite the fact that there are still a plethora of more homeless than they have available beds, which would be contrary to the Jones interpretation. Thus, the city of Reno and the Washoe County area would need approximately 500 to 1,000 more beds in order to maybe meet its needs of the homeless population in this area alone. And if we look at this across the country, the same circumstances apply everywhere, yet cities still are enforcing these ordinances.
Homeless people aren't some special class of humans. They're just people. Some are alcoholics, but people in this neighborhood may also drink too much. Some are addicted to crystal meth bought on the streets. But people in this neighborhood may be addicted to opioids prescribed by their doctors. The real difference between homeless people and other citizens is poverty. The homeless are not all addicted, crazy, or lazy, but they all are poor.